Well, welcome everybody to this, our 13th and final day of live coverage from COP26. I'm Casey Schulberg, Collier County Waterkeeper. I'm so grateful to have with us tonight my co-hosts, Dr. John Capece, the Kissimmee Waterkeeper, and Chris Wilke, Global Advocacy Manager for the Waterkeeper Alliance. Hey, John, how are you? Muted. Hello, Chris. Welcome. Well, if you'll pardon the expression, things are really heating up here in Glasgow, with key agreements coming down to the wire or looking to get signed maybe tomorrow or even Sunday. It's a dogfight at the conference as the conference drives to the finish line with some important language not yet hammered out. I have a feeling that certain people are pulling all-nighters. But before we digest and dissect some of the head-spinning news coming out of COP, I want you all to meet a wonderful waterkeeper from the Middle East. Gidon Bromberg is the Jordan River Waterkeeper from Israel. It's such a pleasure to bring you this gentleman I've just met, Gidon Bromberg, who is the Jordan River Waterkeeper for Israel, because apparently there are 3 Jordan River Waterkeepers. So Gidon was at COP. He just returned to Israel. He was there till the end of last week. So Gidon, welcome, and tell us a little bit about your appearance at COP and what you were trying to move forward, and tell us a little bit about the desalination plant as well in Israel. Sounds fascinating.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to present our work. We're indeed 3 Jordan River Waterkeepers, Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian. And of course, we all work together under one organization, Capece Middle East. And we came to Glasgow to present both formally and informally the proposal for a green-blue deal for the Middle East. And the green-blue deal is inspired by the Biden administration's effort to fight climate change and the European Union's effort of a European Green Deal. But in our setting, water is at the heart of the climate crisis, and that's why we've added the word blue. What we presented is this proposal for a water energy exchange, and it builds on the comparative advantage on the Israeli and Palestinian coast of the Mediterranean to desalinate seawater at large scale in order to meet the climate challenge. We're seeing a 40% reduction in rainfall by the end of this century because of the climate crisis. And we're already the most water scarce part of this planet. So this is a climate adaptation issue of great urgency. On the other hand, Jordan has vast desert areas in the hinterland that can produce large-scale renewable energy that can be sold to the Israeli and Palestinian grids to power our desalination. And in that way, we create healthy interdependencies. For the very first time, having Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians all having something to sell and all having something to buy. And that's incredibly important for peace and stability issues. But in particular for the River Jordan, this water energy exchange creates the possibility to utilize the River Jordan again as the natural regional water carrier. Much due to the conflict, the River Jordan, this famous river that I think every child on earth is familiar with, but sadly, much due to the conflict south of the Sea of Galilee, we've seen conflict leading to competition, and some 97% of the water that used to flow down the river has been taken, half by Israel, the other half by Syria and Jordan. And in its place, because it's the border, the river has sadly become the dumping ground of sewage and agricultural runoff and saline waters. Well, by implementing this water energy exchange that Capece is proposing, we're seeing the potential for large-scale production of water that can be moved to the Sea of Galilee and then released down the River Jordan bringing back to life, this holy river. This is a river holy to the three Abrahamic faiths. Bringing back biodiversity. We've lost 50% of the biodiversity of the river because of the demise, and creating new economic opportunities that are desperately needed to advance climate resilience, because we can't continue to rely just on agriculture in a declining water part of the world. And therefore, by rehabilitating the river, we create new economic opportunities of tourism and trade in addition to agriculture. So we really have the potential of a win-win-win for both people, for Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis, and no less important, for nature.
That is just brilliant, Gidon. The idea, I mean, naturally, I guess the natural tendency would be to desalinate the water and deliver it straight to the people's homes. But you are putting it in the river, which will rejuvenate the ecosystem of the entire length of the river, and probably provide all kinds of ancillary economic opportunities and tourist opportunities for those living along the river. It's such an amazing idea. I mean, you're going to, it might have been more efficient to just deliver it to people's homes where they need it, or water resources. But this is such a beautiful idea because it has knock-on effects, replenishing the biodiversity of the river, and people can draw the water that they need from the river as well. Because I'm sure in a lot of these villages, people just go and they grab the water. They may not have running water in their homes. So this is kind of returning it to the state that it was at one time. It's really brilliant, and it could serve as a poster child for how these kind of projects can happen around the world. And the fact that you've gotten Palestinians, Jordanians, and Israelis to work together, and this is not just three NGOs working together, or three collaborative waterkeepers working together. You have to interrelate with the federal governments. This is quite challenging. So amazing accomplishment. So that's it's fantastic. I'm so pleased to hear that.
So we're advocating. We don't have the agreement of all the governments in place, but coming to COP was part of the advocacy opportunity. So we're able to meet with our own government, but also the climate ambassadors of some of the leading countries in the world, including the Kerry team, highlighting that through the climate crisis entry point, we can both improve water and energy security for the region, and no less importantly, restart the process of rehabilitating the River Jordan that is so famous across the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, for cultural reasons and for the sustainability of the communities along the river, it makes perfect sense. How are you paying for this? And I really like the fact that you referred earlier to how this could actually promote economic development. And there's some commercial resources. How do people get paid? Who's financing all this? And what are the financial benefits for participants?
So firstly, the renewable energy today in our part of the world is the cheapest source of producing electricity. It's cheaper than any fossil source. So the investments in renewables is all private sector. And on the other hand, the development of desalination technology has advanced to such an extent that that's also a profitable enterprise, particularly in such a water scarce part of the world as well. So that too is private sector led. So both the water and energy are actually private sector led. They're profitable enterprises. To clean up the River Jordan does require international assistance, particularly for the Jordanian and Palestinian sides. So we see this as an opportunity for the international community to support through development programming, investments to basically get the sewage out. But once the sewage is out, then the water can be released from the Sea of Galilee and naturally flow with gravitation, towards the end of the Sea of Galilee before it hits the Dead Sea, and then be pumped up to mostly to Jordan's capital, Amman, which in any event is happening. But instead of At the moment, water is being supplied through pipes and cement canals. By building trust and taking the pollution out of what's in the River Jordan, we're able to simply utilize the natural water course and of course gain all these additional synergies and win-wins, as you mentioned, economic, biodiversity, and geopolitical.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, for those of you who are technologically advanced, Gidon has been, since the river is so depleted, he's had no other recourse except to try to simulate what the river might have been at one time for the moment. So tell us about that, Gidon. That sounds interesting too.
So our Jordan River Waterkeepers, we've together developed a virtual world where we've reconstructed 2 locations along the River Jordan, not only because of the depleted state of the river, but because the river is the border, and we're in a conflict zone. There's very limited access for our populations to actually even see the demise, the current state of the river. So we've recreated the river in this virtual world setting, and we bring together Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian youth, activists, educators to come down as avatars to the river. We press a button and we can see what the river used to look like at the turn of last century. Press another button, come down to what the river looks like today, and then our participants can work together to recreate what the Jordan River could look like also into the future. So this is a wonderful tool that again can be utilized in other river systems around the world, particularly those in conflict settings, where we can start to bring people together around the river in a virtual setting, even before we can do so in the real world.
I mean, that's a really interesting way to inspire people to join in your effort, because if they can then visually sort of imagine how the river could flow again, they will then sort of be able to buy into your project and say, okay, let's get it there. Let's have it look like that instead of what it looks like presently. So that's also amazing. We noted that Israel has the highest percentage of R&D relative to its GDP in the world. I think maybe rivaling South Korea. So you really are leaders, and this is what it's going to take, because it's all about technology. We have to develop technology so quickly to try to catch up with all the years we've lost. And I'm not saying that we pull a rabbit out of a hat, but it really is going to depend on those technologies to get us over the cusp, over the bridge, the challenge of what we're facing right now, because we're really facing strong headwinds. It's not at all, evident that we'll be able to achieve the 1.5, much less 2 degrees that we're all striving for. So we're really counting on you. This is wonderful to hear about, Gidon. And I think that we pride ourselves on the passion and the knowledge and the wisdom of waterkeepers all over the world, and you are a terrific example. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Is there anything that we could do for you? Are there any websites you want to highlight, or petitions that you need signed, or something that we can get out to the people who might be watching to help you?
Absolutely. I mean, to your good words there, I think it's very much, we need technological solutions. And as we see in the Corona crisis, we need cooperation. The climate crisis will never be solved singly by one country. We all need to be working together. And given that the climate crisis hits a particular region in a particular way, it's a wake-up call for the Middle East. We all claim to love the land. Well, if we can only love the land in the Middle East if we start working together to save our rivers and our natural environment from the climate crisis. We'd love to highlight our website at www.ecopece.org/green blue deal, because it's the green blue deal where the audience can delve more deeply into the climate solutions that we're proposing that will both advance climate resilience and Middle East peace.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Gidon Bromberg, the Jordan River Waterkeeper from Israel. And Gidon was in Glasgow last week, and he was advancing policies and ideas that should really be a template for us and the rest of the world. So we salute you. We're with you, and anything we can do to help. And we're so appreciative of your efforts. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today, Gidon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and good luck to us all as waterkeepers around the world.
Oh my God, we have so much work to do. All right, thank you, Gidon.
So there we have another stellar example of one of our waterkeepers around the world. I know, Chris, you work with Gidon, and you have experience with him and the other Jordan River keepers. You want to chime in on that, on what we heard from Gidon today?
Well, it's a good model it's a great model for cooperation in this part of the world where conflict seems to arise from the slightest thing. And this issue of water availability, which has been the source of conflict elsewhere, is also showing that it's an opportunity for partnership, that they can solve the problems together better than they can solve them individually. So I think that is a model for the world. If this thing works for them, they may want to, apply for some sort of an award, or someone should nominate them. So I'm anxious to see where it goes. Hopefully the governments will listen and want to cooperate, because it sounds like they do need the cooperation of the governments to see it through.
Yeah, I don't think they're quite there yet. John, I know that technology is really key in your point of view to solving some of these problems. Anything come to mind from what we heard from Gidon, or you want to talk about technology or international cooperation?
Well, it's interesting that they were highlighting the role that conflict plays. And I believe what he's describing is that conflict is an impediment, an obstacle, or an additional complicating factor to the solutions to their challenges, to their water challenges. But it's not really the source of the water challenges they face in the Jordan River. That's a very traditional supply versus demand challenge in the developing area with a growing population in a water scarce area. You're likely to have a situation where you drained or used the naturally generated water supply. Therefore, you need to augment it in some fashion through groundwater or desalinization, as they were describing here. Central Asia has an even more extreme situation where they've dried up an entirely huge inland sea, the Aral Sea. But the other thing that the Jordan Waterkeeper described was key to an overall, I believe, theme in dealing with the climate challenge, and that's energy. Desalinization is a combination of energy and technology. The technology has advanced considerably to where we have semi-permeable membranes. You combine that with pumps to add pressure to the water, and you have a desalinization process which separates low salt water and higher salt water concentration. So the solutions here require more energy, and that's the challenge we're facing with the climate change issue in general. Is we have fossil fuel sources of energy, so we need to move to renewables. But not only do we need to move to renewables, we need more energy. Just the total amount of energy needs to be vastly, vastly greater than what it is today. And we can talk more about that as we go through this conversation.
Great, John. So we're going to do things a little bit differently tonight. John and Chris and I are going to look back on what happened and what didn't happen over this COP and what might still happen. So the first development out of COP during this session was deforestation. And this is a big deal. Monday night, 130 nations signed a protocol to stop or reverse deforestation by the end of the decade. That represents 90% of the world's forests. But with this agreement, as with all others made here or in prior conferences, the question is implementation, not just the deal. So we signed the deal. They all got on board. They signed this deal, which is great. But how faithful are we going to be in implementing this deal? And it's similar with the climate action tracker. They put forward statistics that contrasted the pledges of various nations to the actual policy of various nations. And that pushed us from a probability, this is talking about temperature rise, it pushed us from a probability of 1.5 to 2.4 or 2.7 over the next, till the end of the decade. So it gets back to implementation. So Laura Duncanson, assistant professor of geographical sciences, who participated virtually in monitoring the lungs of the world from space, said the commitment to end deforestation by 2030 is certainly welcome news and very exciting. However, similar pledges were made in 2014, and we've not seen a decrease in deforestation to date. She noted that the pledge is supported by financial commitments of $1.7 billion to support indigenous people's conservation of tropical forests and $1.5 billion to support conservation of the Congo Basin. So she's suggesting that will help. But again, the rubber has to meet the road. And Chris, I know you had an observation about how much of this forest or tropical land is under the stewardship of indigenous peoples. I think you mentioned something to that effect the other day. Chris, are you with us?
Yep, I hit the wrong button.
Yep.
The quote that I got from Paul Wilson, who is Klamath River activist, Klamath tribal activist, who is here with us, is that 80% of the world's biodiversity is on lands stewarded by indigenous peoples, because they have successfully kept that land and those ecosystems largely intact for millennia. We have something, a very good lesson that we can learn for them. But deforestation can definitely impact indigenous people, as we've already discussed with hydropower, which is often a form of deforestation because they usually cut the forest right before they flood it. But in other circumstances, we do have to walk a line here, because sometimes protections actually threaten indigenous people. And that was another thing I learned at this COP, was that this fortress conservation, where you are kicking all the people out of the area because of there's some small trade in charcoal or traditional harvesting. In order to recover the biodiversity, they kick the indigenous people out, and so that's a very real thing as well. So we need to look at all of that, but the statistic stands for itself. If you want to know who's doing a good job of protecting biodiversity, let's learn some of those lessons.
John, do you want to chime in on deforestation or the monitoring and implementation of these deals? Have anything that you want to add on that subject?
Well, anytime you set a deadline that's somewhat distant during a process that's rapidly removing our forests, they could simply achieve their goal of halting deforestation by 2030 by having completed deforestation by 2030. So I'm not all that encouraged when I hear dates set upon an activity that's rapidly progressing and could intensify. Yeah.
Again, that doesn't necessarily mean they won't stop tomorrow. So point well taken. We had another big deal develop on Tuesday of last week, the Global Methane Pledge. So Tuesday, more than 100 countries joined the US and the EU in an effort to cut emissions of methane from 2020 levels by 30% by the year 2030. So giving us 10 years to cut methane levels by 30%. As you all know, because you're such avid students of climate change, methane is second only to carbon dioxide in terms of its impact on climate. And this initiative was also backed by money, $300 million from philanthropic organizations. So that always helps when there's money promised toward a goal. John, tell us about methane, why it's so damaging, and why curbing a methane emission is important.
Well, different greenhouse gases intercept different wavelengths of radiation and therefore have different heating potential. And methane is a more intense heat generator when subject to certain types of radiation, but it's a shorter lived contaminant within our atmosphere. So while it's more intense, while it's damaging our heat budget, it can be eliminated. If we eliminate its sources, then it can be eliminated from the atmosphere much more rapidly than carbon dioxide. So it makes sense to focus on methane now, because if we achieve those reductions, they will manifest into global heat budget benefits more rapidly than carbon dioxide. So simply eliminating the emissions of carbon dioxide won't be enough. You'll have to actually remove carbon dioxide. However, if you eliminate the emissions of methane, you won't necessarily have to remove it because it naturally degrades from our atmosphere more rapidly than CO2.
Yeah. I had heard that solving this now can actually eliminate a lot of the methane because it doesn't have as long a shelf life, so it can you can pull it out of the system and then have a measurable improvement. What are the greatest sources of methane, John? You have some stats on that?
I don't have statistics on it, but it's also been the case that they're having a very difficult time quantifying it, because we've heard so many times where the leaks from our fossil fuel industry were estimated to be X, and then a report 2 years later says, gosh, maybe it's 2X or 3X. We've been grossly underestimating this source of methane. Then, of course, we have the animal livestock industry that generates an awful lot of methane. Then, of course, we have natural systems methane production. But of course, as long as you have a stable and healthy natural ecosystem, that rate of methane production was already, accounted for within our natural global heat budget. So that's not really a sector that we should necessarily focus on reducing, because natural systems have alternate other benefits to us as well. So we have to focus on our anthropogenic sources of methane, which are largely our fossil fuel industry and our agricultural industry.
Yeah. Apparently, there's a lot of methane that leaks just out of pipes. Sort of, there's just not some of the pipes are not very efficient, and apparently, when you're drilling for fossil fuels, even if your methane is emitted from the process, there's certain spillage there. And then, of course, we all know about cows and livestock, which we should put a little parenthetical note in. We should try to ease off meat as much as we can, because the production of the commercial meat industry is a real stressor on the environment. And John, I think you quoted that it takes 10 times more energy to create the same amount of protein from beef as from vegetable products. So is that correct, John?
Well, it varies based upon source, chicken, pork, fish, and so on. But I believe the upper limit of that is on the order of 10 times.
Yeah. Yeah. So methane, that was an accomplishment. You know, we should recognize that that was an absolute accomplishment earlier this week.
One of the things that was, and not to take anything away from that, because I think that the methane deal, methane pledge is one of the important accomplishments of this COP, but a lot of that is stuff that should have been happening already, particularly the leaks around fossil fuels. As you said, that we're finding that natural gas pipelines are leaking, the fracking process, the oil extraction process. We've known about the methane problem in these areas for a long time. And if we can transition away from those fuel sources, we won't need to control those leaks anymore. Right. And that is, I don't have the statistics for it, but I think that oil and gas are approximately half of the anthropogenic methane sources. The other being agriculture, and then to a lesser extent landfills. And I don't know how strongly it showed up on the radar, but we've already discovered that hydroelectric dams can also be a source of methane.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we will have to take responsibility for the positive feedback that will create methane generation from permafrost and seabed methane hydrates.
That was the other thing that I learned, is that there's more methane currently locked up in permafrost than is in the atmosphere. So if we don't get off the dime and get this, get our temperature stabilized, that is going to trigger a methane release from the permafrost that won't recover for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Permafrost is created over several hundred years. It's not just one cold snap to create permafrost. Permafrost, of course, is the top layer of soil in the polar regions that is frozen year round, and it goes down I think 5 or 6 meters in places where it's essentially frozen year round. Even if the top layer thaws, the beneath that is solid, and there is so much carbon that's locked up in there. If that gets released, human beings can go down to zero, but it's going to keep warming the planet from this monster that we've let out of the bag.
Yeah.
Yeah, I describe that process of the positive feedbacks as being and our attempts to reduce our emissions. In such a scenario, our efforts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions amount to blowing out a match after we've already lit the drapes on fire and the house is engulfed in flames. Blowing out the match, our match, isn't going to solve the problem.
And Chris, you sat in on a panel, I think last night, you found very discouraging about the amount of sheet ice we're going to lose and the amount of warming that's going to. Didn't you mention something like that, Chris?
It was at the cryosphere pavilion. The cryosphere, of course, is the part of the world that is frozen all or most of the year, and wouldn't use the word discouraged but dismayed and shocking what I heard. I mean, I already knew these concepts in general terms, that the Arctic and the Antarctic are experiencing warming faster than other regions of the world. But the extent at which the potential for ecosystems and weather patterns to unravel, and eventually the Greenland ice sheet discharging that will raise the sea level rise. Essentially, what they showed us was where we are now, what we've triggered, where we would. They had these 3-sided signs that you could read, and where we are now, what we've already triggered, where we will be if we implement the most aggressive climate agreements that are on the table, which is still worse than today, right? We don't get to a better future by implementing all these climate agreements. We're still going to get worse, actually. But the alternative. There was another side of the triangle was if we just simply implement the Paris Agreement, which would get us to around 2.6 degrees, even though it was a pledge to keep it to 1.5. The actual things that were on the table would actually take us to 2.6. Or if we actually kept at the rate we're doing the things that we're doing now, would take us to 3.1 degrees of climate change. And they talked about the worsening impacts of the Arctic. And we will, most of us, including old codgers like us, we may see ice-free Arctic in our lifetimes, maybe just for a few weeks in September. But this will be the first time human beings, not history, but human beings being on this planet, have lived on a planet without Arctic ice.
Yeah.
It's the Arctic reductions, the depletion of the Arctic sea ice, back in the mid-1980s when these projections were first made, the estimate was that by around 2060, we would have an ice-free Arctic. And in fact, our minimum coverage area now, I believe, is on the order of 4 million square kilometers, and an annual variation of about plus or minus 1 million. So once we get down to from 4 down to 1 million, in all likelihood, we're going to then hit that 0 point in any given year over a 10-year period, because that tends to be the uncertainty, the natural variability in that annual value. So we're still on track for hitting absolute zero, steady zero by 2060, but definitely hitting an episodic zero long before then, probably could be by 2030, 2040.
Yeah, and the essentially where we're at right now, we've already triggered 2 meters of sea level rise. We haven't experienced that yet. We're at only what we're observing is a small fraction of that. But if we shut off, if we got carbon net zero today, we would still, those mechanisms are in place. The seas will keep rising. We will get to 2 meters of sea level rise. And this is my earlier comment. You asked if I was discouraged. I'm actually emboldened to work harder on this now. So that doesn't fit the definition of discouraged, because the future is so much better if we can hold climate change to 1.5 or even very close to that number. And it, life becomes very hard. The earth becomes very hard for human beings and other life to exist if we keep going at the pace we're at. So, certain amount of displacement, certain amount of crop failures, certain amount of droughts and super storms, we can try to adapt to, and it won't be pleasant. But the alternative is, actual collapse of ecosystems and widespread famine, and it's just bleak. So it couldn't be clearer, our call to action. Even though the news is bad, worse, and terrible, I'm going to take bad and fight for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we've seen a lot of modeling. What we're trying to do, we know it's going to peak and get worse. We're just trying to see if we can then rein it in after a certain amount of time, or if it just can continue to incline upward. And then, that basically spells the destruction of the biosphere as we know it. Another big thing that happened this last week was the China-US talks. Nothing really concrete was established, but it was important that the 2 largest emitters of greenhouse gases at least were at the table together and talking about cooperating. This was a big advancement. And they made a big deal out of it. Kerry made the announcement on his side, and the climate change envoy from China made the announcement on the other side. So both sides will recall their firm commitment to work together to achieve the 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature goal set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement. They called for stepped up efforts to close the significant gap that remains to achieve that target. So you know what, and I heard interviews with Kerry after that, and he says, well, this is just the beginning of the discussion. And yes, nothing concrete was established, but we will get there. We will start to you know, to sort of cinch it down and try to get some specific proposals on the table that we can agree with. But people did feel it was at least a positive indicator that these countries were speaking, because, you know, as you know, President Xi did not attend. So we were kind of wondering how big a hole that was going to create. So, John, Chris, you have any comments about the China-US talks, the beginning of those talks?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical that the two largest economies on the planet work together, not only to reduce their emissions, but also to drive forward the technologies that are going to be required for us to get through this crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and we are going to need those specifics for it to be real, but this is a lot better than no agreement. And the two countries definitely, for a variety of reasons, need to be better at working together. And there's, you know, been some real deep problems that have developed over the last 4 years, 4 or 5 years. So this positive thing, but I would say it's definitely too early to celebrate.
And what's interesting is, you know, this is not a new development. Back in the 1980s, when we were first looking at the climate crisis and the overall environmental crisis, you know, it was before China began its dramatic growth. And it was very clear to us in the engineering community that what we needed to do back in the 80s was push forward technologies, move to green technologies then, so that we could export those technologies to China and have them develop, have them ramp up their economy using sustainable technologies rather than our old destructive ones. But of course, that was ignored in favor of a short-term profit model. The United States had a policy of facilitating the development of China, but they insisted upon having our corporations generate easy profits by selling to them existing technology rather than taking the loss at the beginning by investing and developing new technologies, and then having everyone, all the emerging economies, develop using those much improved technologies. So we had opportunities many decades, several decades ago, that we completely ignored, and here we are.
Yeah, and you know, we're just really focusing on the top line, the huge top line, you know, agreements or protocols that were announced. There was a lot of secondary stuff with one country pledging support for another country, or, you know, the UK is operating around the world. So we're just kind of focusing on the big stuff. So now we get to what I call the problem children. The first one is the zero emission vehicle pledge. It is not a done deal. According to a declaration published Wednesday, UK COP presidency wanted to get governments, manufacturers, and investors to promise to work toward all sales of new cars and vans being zero emission globally by 2040, and by no later than 2035 in leading markets. But the proposal was not signed by several key countries and companies. Germany, China, Japan, South Korea, the United States did not sign the declaration. Toyota, Volkswagen, BMW, Nissan also refrained from signing. There were some notable signatories. Ford and General Motors agreed, as did Jaguar, Land Rover, Mercedes-Benz, Volvo. Among countries, US states and cities, because cities were signing onto this, were the UK, Canada, Poland, Kenya, India, the Australian Capital Territory, Catalonia, Atlanta, San Diego, New York City, San Francisco, and Seoul. So that agreement is still in doubt. And part of the problem is, I mean, in the US, we basically have the commercial car companies leading, and we're you know, with the infrastructure deal, we will have charging stations, and, you know, everyone's turning to electric vehicles. But in third world countries where people have mopeds and three-wheeled you know, little vehicles, and they're really large emitters of carbon, and you know, those people don't have the money to go out and buy an electric car. So again, they're asking for the developed countries to create funding to allow these underdeveloped countries to get up to speed with the electric vehicle transition. And there seems to be resistance to that. So that is definitely not a done deal as of this date. Any comments on that, John and Chris?
Yeah, I heard, the U.S. EPA administrator speaking the other day in the U.S. Center, and he articulated this 2035 goal of all electric fleet as far as new vehicles, at least. I'm not sure about eliminating existing vehicles, but all new vehicle sales by 2035 being electric. So the administration, the current administration, has set this goal. Whether future administrations will respect that is uncertain. So as in the same session, the USAID administrators described programs they were ramping up to help deploy these technologies in the emerging economy. So while they may not have signed the agreement, they've made statements that seem to be consistent with the aspirations that you described. So maybe there are other aspects of the agreement that are the sticking points rather than the primary goal.
I don't know. Yeah, I just read that they had not signed. So the next big sticking point is on loss and damage. As you know, the less developed countries feel that they were burdened with the impact of climate change, and they were not responsible for it. So vulnerable countries argue that wealthy countries are more responsible historically for climate change. And some countries on the front lines of the crisis feel that the nations that have polluted the most should be held liable and even pay reparations. So even though the US signed on to a recent statement from a group of 61 countries known as the High Ambition Coalition, which agreed to increase resources for particularly vulnerable countries, the senior US official said the US still has a lot of questions about how that would work in practice. So currently, the US does not support the creation of a loss and damage compensation fund, an idea being pushed by COP26 by developing and smaller countries, particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So there we go. It's back to money, and what is our responsibility in this issue, and how do we fund that? And of course, in the U.S., you can't just by the stroke of a pen create funding. It has to go through the Congress, and we got all those issues. But John, Chris, anything you want to weigh in on that loss and damage? I know that that's particularly. The indigenous people and less developed have taken this completely to heart, and they feel betrayed by the U.S. for not signing this, and perhaps rightly so. John, Chris?
I think it's an age-old question. How do you hold people in power accountable? Clearly the U.S. has a lot of global power that it wields in a lot of different ways, and historically has probably wielded it even more bluntly than today, though it's still a problem. And that's a very good point. If I heard the president of Colombia speaking on National Public Radio right before I got on the plane to fly to the COP, and his policies are not great, by the way, when it comes to climate change. But he did make an interesting point, was that his country is responsible for 0.5% of the problem. And I don't know how accurate that actual number is, but if it's anywhere in the ballpark, and you look at, I think it was, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I think the US and China combined for 40% of the problem. China leads us with a bigger total impact, and we definitely lead on a per capita versus China. I think we're double the per capita impact. So when you start getting to displacement of people, crop failures, sea level rise is going to affect so many people in the next century from now. It has been creeping along like this, just barely measurable, and all the predictions showed that it's going to start going like that. And we are almost to the knee of that curve. So, impacts of sea level rise are going to be very significant within, people that are alive now are going to know those impacts, and that's very expensive, especially for cities that will be impacted by that. And do the people that created this problem owe something to the recipients of the damage? A lot of people would say yes. So I think those are very important viewpoints, and I don't know how popular those sentiments would be, in terms of the full population of the U.S. embracing those concepts. But you break it, you buy it. That's a lot of people understand that mantra. So I think it's something very important to consider, and we definitely have to be helping to solve those problems and provide funding as much as we can.
Yeah, that's going to be a biggie, and very hard to get us to the finish line there. The next big deal, and this is really the gorilla in the room, is the fossil fuel deal. And I was amazed to hear that the words fossil fuel had never been a part of any COP declaration in the past. This is the first year that even the mention of fossil fuel was incorporated into the COP documents, which I find astounding. But let me just point something out. A recent study in the scientific journal Nature suggests that to stand a 50% chance of avoiding more than 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating, we need to retire 89% of proven coal reserves, 58% of oil reserves, and 59% of fossil methane, natural gas. If we want better odds than 50-50, we will need to leave almost all of them untouched. There was major pushback. This is by no means resolved. In a ministerial statement ahead of the COP26, which started in Glasgow, October 2031, the group of like-minded developing countries issued a strong rebuke to the UK host for calling on all countries to cut their emissions to net zero by the middle of the century. Ministers from the group of 24 nations, including China, India, Egypt, Indonesia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Vietnam, accused rich nations of failing to address their historic responsibility for causing climate change and shifting the burden onto developing economies. Major developed countries are now pushing, one gentleman said, major developed countries are now pushing to shift the goalposts of the Paris Agreement from what have already been agreed by calling for all countries to adopt net zero targets by 2050. This new goal, which is being advanced, runs counter to the Paris Agreement and is anti-equity and against climate justice. Instead, developed countries should aim for their full decarbonization within this decade to allow developing countries more time to grow their economies and meet energy demands, the statement said. And Bolivia's chief negotiator, Diego Pacheco, who represents the LMDC, which is these like-minded developing countries, said on Thursday that the countries felt the developed world was trying to transfer the responsibility for the climate crisis onto the developed world. So this is a whole quandary and a whole dilemma, and very hard to solve. It gets back to what we just talked about of damage and loss. Is it fair to apply the same reduction of fossil fuels across the world when the rest of the world needs those energies to power their economies, and we have not divested ourselves from fossil fuels that we created in the first place? So, Chris, I'm sure you have something to say about that, as does John.
Yeah, well, just as a reaction to that, this doesn't represent any hardened policy or anything like that, but I think it should be obvious that not only is the developed world emitting more, but we've historically been really the cause of the problem where we are today. So I think that the developed world, particularly US and the real developed parts of China and Europe, need to decarbonize very quickly, and it's their responsibility to show the way because they have the resources to do it. If the economies of scale come to fruition, it should be cheaper to implement in the developing world. So that is, I think, sort of an altruistic truth that we broke it. We're still just, emitting more. We have the resources to fix it. We should definitely take the lead on it. And there's an equity issue of assisting countries with the damage. That said, all of that said, the numbers don't lie. What they said based on, it's just like with the coronavirus, it's a mathematical prediction that comes true over time. It's the same thing with climate change. We have to decarbonize this planet as fast as we can. And the number was 89% of all coal. And what did you say for oil and gas?
Yeah, let me just get back to that. So we would, to have a chance of hitting the 1.5 degree target, we need to retire 89% of coal reserves, 58% of oil reserves, and 59% of fossil methane.
Mm-hmm. So those are existing reserves. That's existing production, essentially. They're saying needs to be retired. We are so far away from that because we are still developing new reserves. And the head of the International Energy Agency this year said, in a very proactive statement that was really, it was upon the release of their report, A Pathway to Net Zero, or a pathway to 1.5, I think is what they said, is that all investment in new oil and gas reserves has to stop from this point forward. Mm-hmm. That was in May of 2021. And I think of our waterkeepers in Senegal, for example, that are facing offshore oil drilling going into production within 2 years off their coast. They've done the exploration, they've done the seismic testing, they're ramping up that. Unless someone is able to stop that, that is going to go into production. That is still, we're digging a hole that's deeper. And the mathematics of this, we are still trying to regulate all the million points of combustion instead of sealing off those reserves where those fossil fuels are in the ground. There's a much smaller number of problems we'll need to solve by shutting down the production than we will by trying to regulate every emission source across the planet. I think both those things are true, but I think you need to lean into the first and show the way and then help rather than point the finger at the rest of the world.
I agree with you. There's also the question of oil reserves, because we've, America, a lot of these countries, China, India, Canada, the US have enormous oil reserves. So even if we stop drilling for oil, we still may be selling those to other countries. So that's another thing to keep in mind. John, you have something you want to comment on about the fossil fuel deal? This is really a thorny issue. They're trying to hammer out the wording. They're hoping to have something tomorrow or Sunday, but there's no guarantee that enough countries will sign on to have it really be a significant advance. Anything you want to comment there, John?
I guess I'm not very sympathetic to the stranded assets of major corporations or even nations. I mean, it's a different world, different time. These are no longer assets, they are liabilities. Also, the rate at which the developing nations reduce their current emissions per capita is not going to make or break the solution. It's the rate at which the developed nations in China do so, and the rate at which they develop technologies to begin removing the existing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the ocean. So if we do what's necessary on the investment side in the West, in the developed economies, in the major economies, and develop these technologies and implement these programs and achieve our reduction, the rest of the world will just come along for the ride, because that will dominate the product and service sector at that point.
So I think there's a chance that we may take a lead. It looks as though the administration is coming out hard. So we hope so. We hope so.
The other aspect of that is, you know, the developing nations, the challenge they pose to us is not necessarily in their historic emissions, because they've had very low per capita. But what's been happening is, you know, they've had higher reproduction rates, so their populations are growing more rapidly, and those populations aspire to the same standard of living that we've enjoyed in the West for decades. So they will be seeking to grow, and if we do not provide them the sustainable technologies and products and services, then they're going to use the old dirty methods. So we need to quickly deliver them sustainable options, so as their population improves their standards of living, they're doing so with far less harmful methods.
Yeah, so we could have spent an entire night on any one of these subjects, but we just don't have the time. And with the brain power we have with Chris and John, we could have gone on for quite a while. I wanted to just talk for a second about the unique opportunity that we have as waterkeepers. And we've interviewed some wonderful waterkeepers all week long, and they just, you know, they're so impressive with their knowledge and their commitment and their interest in the climate change issue. So we talked a little bit about what is unique about the Waterkeeper movement is that because of all of our grassroots work and our protests and our activism and advocacy, we're trusted by the protesters and by the students. And yet we can go into a room with the delegates and talk to them on their level, because there's we're science-based, we carry a lot of data, so we can commune with people. So it seems to me that's a kind of a unique opportunity, and one that we should try to capitalize on and try to increase the impact that we might have on this process. So I don't know just how that happens, and I'm sure that there are people who've been thinking about this at the Waterkeeper Alliance. Chris has been thinking about it, but I would love to see some kind of a cohesive effort on the part of waterkeepers to kind of come and inform people and try to deliver some progress and some participation. John, Chris, do you have any comments you want to make on that?
I think that the next Waterkeeper conference presents an excellent opportunity to have this discussion. I don't want to propose what waterkeepers would set as their goal coming to COP26, because I anticipate they will have their own idea. But I would say this, that, you know, if we tripled or quadrupled or quintupled the number of waterkeepers that came to the COP, if we had that many separate agendas, it would be just like everything else. We would be you know, colleagues and have friendly conversations, but then we would all go into our own rooms pushing for our own things. But if we could develop a common agenda, even if you have your own separate agendas, that we could also develop a sort of a campaign plan around that, and with real targets at the COP, and maybe really accomplish something. We have new IPCC reports coming out in February and April of next year, the adaptation and the mitigation. So the one we got last August was State of the Science, which is how bad are things, and what is the imperative to do the work. And then there'll be much more specifics on how to reduce the carbon and how to adapt to a higher carbon world that will be coming out next year. And then immediately after those, in June, we have the Waterkeeper Conference. So that would be a great opportunity to have these discussions and see who is interested in moving forward.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an interesting avenue there, a path forward, I think. John, anything on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So since 1994, when I was one of the co-founders of what became Calusa Waterkeeper later on, I've been advocating that we take a dual water and climate perspective on all of our issues. So it's been an imperative for me for decades. But today, I think the reality is such that we have that opportunity that you described relative to mobilizing people. So that's an interesting discussion track. But there's another more hard-edged policy analytical element to that. And our traditional mandate has been to protect water bodies and watersheds. And as environmentalism gives way to climate survival, we may have a more difficult time getting government agencies to pay sufficient attention. It's been difficult enough, as it is, but it's likely to become more difficult, except, from the perspective of resilience. But resilience implies that it's a consumable resource, that, it's a barrier. It will take the beating for us. And that's not our objective with the environment, but it may be the reality. But we also need to advocate for our watersheds and water bodies in the language of today, in the priorities of climate change. And that involves the sequestration of carbon. How much carbon can these watersheds take up through proper management that we've advocated all along? As you sequester carbon in the soil, in seagrasses and such, in plant material, you automatically pick up the nitrogen and phosphorus that we've long sought to eliminate in runoff. That's been the source of so much of the degradation of our water bodies and watersheds forever. So if we present our goal in terms of the carbon accounting, I think we can realize better success and draw more resources to our watershed and water bodies management efforts. Secondly, we have projects that we try to implement. And just as every other part of the economy has to decarbonize those products and services, we need to do that with our water restoration and water protection projects. So we need to begin thinking along the lines of systems ecology and take into account this. And as we propose projects, as we advocate projects, we need to make sure those projects are reduced carbon, carbon neutral, carbon negative. And that involves an awful lot of accounting and revisiting our projects and methods and taking a much more detailed look at them. So that's going to be a challenge, develop the analytical methods to do that. But I think it's something that Waterkeepers can contribute to and begin to advocate, because that has been grossly absent even within the Water Pavilion presentations here at COP. Very few have said, okay, here's a project, here's its carbon implication, here's how we could decarbonize that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a perfect path forward, because every watershed can sequester carbon in various ways. So that is, we can kind of map that out and tell people how to do it in wetlands, how to do it in the desert, how to do it in, on the coastal areas. So that's a great first step, I think, in creating a worldwide waterkeeper program. So speaking of worldwide waterkeepers, we're so privileged to have brought some of those voices to the fore over the last 13 days. That was a privilege. And we were really pleased to be able to communicate, listen, be your eyes and ears on the ground, to try to relay some of the information that we had here. So we're just really grateful for people that tuned in and are interested, and we will try to build this cause and be even more effective, in the coming months, because it is all hands on deck. So once again, thank you, everybody. And we have a little sign off that for this our 13th program, which Michael will now play.
So folks, this here, my friends, is the crew that brought you 13 days of live coverage from COP26. If this were a Bond movie, Rock would be 007.
Taken us 26 years to realize that maybe one world is not enough.
And John Capece is our M.
Honestly, these conferences always leave me deeply shaken, but at the same time stirred to action.
And Chris is CIA operative Felix Leiter.
One thing that I've learned is that climate change is pretty much like every Bond villain wrapped up into one.
So there you have it, folks. And let's not forget, up in the rafters, our dear friend, Mr. Michael Fiedler, or shall we say Sir Michael Fiedler. Thank you, Michael.
I just want to give thanks to all the waterkeepers from all over the world that were able to join us for this. This was great, and hopefully we met some new waterkeepers here at the conference.
And hopefully we'll see you again next year.
Hopefully. Signing off from Glasgow.
Yeah, I hope we're not underwater next year. Thank you so much, folks, for tuning in. It was our pleasure.